There's a lot of skepticism at the moment with regards to vaccines in general since the COVID pandemic. There had always been people who were skeptical about vaccines and looking at issues like autism and so on, but this has rapidly increased in the past 4 years. Now, fundamentally, the cause of that is because there was a lot of propaganda and marketing around COVID vaccines. And it's almost as if the people who were involved in that were willing to sell the reputation of all vaccines just to protect the technology associated with mRNA. This fundamentally has driven vaccine skepticism. And I'm going to be sharing here an interesting article with regards to exactly what has been happening from someone who's been very vocal all the way through. And this is from Real Clear Politics, The Cure for Vaccine Skepticism. It's a commentary by Martin Kulldorff. Now, the first thing that I noticed when I went to this commentary is that I got a warning from my browser about the fact that they couldn't verify the safety of this page. Very unusual. Essentially, they don't like Martin Kulldorff and they have never liked him because he took a very strong position early on in the pandemic. And if you don't know who he is and why they don't like him, it's because he was part of this great Barrington Declaration. And this team of people, epidemiologists and public health scientists, were focused about or highlighting that they should use focus protection instead of a major lockdown. And they got over 941,000 signatures on this across the world. And essentially, this here is Martin Kulldorff. Interestingly, the other person here, Jay Bhattacharya, is potentially going to be the Trump appointee for the NIH. So the two of them together took a very strong stance, and they have never been liked by the mainstream ever since they did that. No surprise. It seems as though potentially they were right. Now, why would that be such a problem? Well, it means that at the moment, those who are trying to silence those challenges are struggling, especially if RFK Jr. gets the position in terms of the US politics. A huge challenge ahead. And I know this feeling of being silenced. Now, you may not know this, and I keep on talking, but in reality, my reach across my social media contacts has dropped by over 80%. It's remarkable. And it's largely because I have been ongoing talking about Disease X. Are You Prepared? It's still in the bestseller in viral diseases. We've now got 3 5-star reviews. Please join us as we go through the science around what happens in COVID 19. The reason that this book is not liked is because, in reality, I challenge the science, and I'm not one of those who is going along with just supporting a narrative. I just look at the science. And for those who don't quite know what I've been focused on from early in the pandemic, I have been focused on autoimmunity to the spike protein of the virus. And so I have always been skeptical about broad use of spike protein to try and prevent disease when it's the cause of severe disease. I'm just simple that way. If I hear arsenic is causing problems, I don't give it to you. So I think fundamentally, the people haven't grasped how significant spike protein is in driving the cytokine storm in severe COVID 19. If they did, they would realize why my position on this is so clear. But let's get back to this question on the cure for vaccine skepticism from Martin Kulldorff. As I said, this was published on the 23rd of December, 2024. And he highlights this important point. The only way to restore public trust in vaccination is to put a well known vaccine skeptic in charge of vaccine research agenda. Now, he's confident about this because he believes generally in vaccines and the benefit of it. And he has highlighted that they were first conceived in 1774 by Benjamin Jesty, a farmer in Dorset, and he created the first smallpox vaccine, which has saved millions of lives. Now, that really is very, very important because vaccines are an essential part of health and health protection. And one of the problems is that people have been broadly using the term anti vaxxer for people who question the COVID vaccine and the mRNA technology. That's not fair. That's not right because they are not the same, as you can see when you look around you. I just asked myself the question today: when last have I seen a case of measles? Hmm. I don't know. It's years, maybe decades. I can't remember when last I've seen a case of measles. When last have I seen a case of COVID? Hmm, days maybe. Meaning that they are just not on the same wavelength. And this is part of the problem. I've said that people who are pro vaccine or pro COVID vaccine are so focused on it that they are willing to destroy the reputation of all other vaccines just to protect that one. Makes no sense to me. Just look at the data. I mean, they are just not in the same wavelength. And I think this is what Malted Kulldorff recognizes. He knows that when you look at the data, the good old fashioned vaccines are going to stand up to the test of challenge. It may not be the same for some of the newer ones. And he makes this point here as he goes on. He highlights here what went wrong. The purpose of COVID vaccines was to reduce mortality and hospitalization, but the randomized trials were only designed to demonstrate short term reduction in COVID symptoms, which is not of great public health importance. This is very important point, and a lot of people don't quite get this. They were looking at short term symptom reduction after the vaccine, and what you should have been looking at is in terms of hospitalization, whether or not people get onto intensive care. Now, it did have an impact on that, but probably not as significant as they would have hoped. And so the short term reduction in symptoms seemed as though that was a better target in terms of putting forward strong, robust data. That was a mistake because what it then did is it set it up to fail because the real world data would eventually come out. And so he highlights another point here is that also, since the placebo groups were promptly vaccinated after the emergency approval, they also failed to provide reliable information about adverse reactions. Really important point. And however, he says, despite these flaws, it was falsely claimed that the vaccine induced immunity is superior to natural infection acquired immunity and that the vaccines would prevent infection and transmission. As I said, um, I was in the cohort of people who, from the start, looked at it and said, this can't work. And to be frank with you, I remember when the data came out and the data was showing that this was remarkable. And I thought, how could the science be so wrong? It made no sense to me. But then when I started to dig further, I realized, oh, this is why. And then time shows the evidence. Because fundamentally, an injectable vaccine is unable, in the context of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, unable to provide adequate mucosal protection or training to fight off the virus. And additionally, when we talk about natural immunity versus hybrid immunity primarily focuses on the spike protein and driving the immune system to produce antibodies against it. When you look at natural immunity, so if someone gets infected, only 20% of the epitopes are focused on the spike protein. The other 80% are focused on multiple other proteins in the virus, and that's why it's much broader and less amenable to being tricked by the variants. So, in that sense, it was set up in a sense to cause problems that we would struggle with down the line. As well, when we go back to the article here, they made the mistakes as well. Governments and universities then mandated these vaccines for people with superior natural immunity and for young people with very low mortality risk. Now, this is a really, really important point, and a lot of people don't quite understand how important this point is. Think about it. If you had to be, oh dear, I'm trying to think about how to say this without getting censored. Maybe I shouldn't say it. The essential point is this: natural immunity, as I said, is quite broad and quite effective. And what a lot of people are not realizing is that in low vaccinated regions, I think Bulgaria was a good example, which is one of the lowest vaccinated regions in Europe. They did have a surge of deaths early in the pandemic with regards to the fact that people got severe COVID 19. And because there was no other way of managing it, I can't even say how you could, but because of that, they had a surge of death, but then the population got herd immunity. And that herd immunity then protected that population against further problems. So that's how natural immunity would work. And I think that eventually there will have to be an acknowledgement that where we are now with circulating variants in highly vaccinated regions, even though it may be inconvenient, I'm surprised that they haven't yet reflected on whether or not their approach has driven the problem to occur. Just in case the censors are listening, I did not say, I just asked if it was possible. Now, getting back to the article here, just looking again at some important work, here he says the government and pharmaceutical companies lied about the COVID vaccine, and they are also lying about other vaccines. Skepticism has now spread to tried and true vaccines that are proven to work. This is exactly what has happened. In effect, they have burned the reputation of all vaccines by putting them all together. And I think this was deliberately. They thought that maybe if they could tie everything together, that would protect the technology of mRNA and COVID vaccines. And that's why it went on to get the Nobel Prize and all of that. But instead, what has happened is that people's trust generally in government, in science, in research, in vaccines has plummeted. Even in doctors, there is a 30% fall from 70% to 40% in the trust of doctors. All of this tied to the fact that the science appeared to be so way off target, let me say it that way, from what was told to people initially. And that has not been acknowledged as yet from those who are in public health and so on, or those who are even in the scientific community. They keep on defending it instead of doing the critical acknowledgement. Okay, we thought this, but this didn't happen. This was a mistake. We probably shouldn't have done it that way. Let's make sure we don't do it again. And the principle I have now gone by is anyone who has remained silent on that point should never be put in that position to do that mistake again. And so, for all those who are remaining silent in the scientific community, if I was asked, I would say, no, you shouldn't get that opportunity again because you clearly haven't even recognized what mistake you made in the past. So, in summary, at the end, I'll try and see if I can catch the summary here from here. He says, we won't restore vaccine confidence by preaching to the choir. After the COVID debacle, Kennedy, this is RFK, his stated goal is to return to evidence based medicine free from conflicts of interest. And letting him do that is the only way that skeptics will trust vaccines again. And those of us who trust vaccines have no reason to be afraid of that. Completely agree. If you trust the science, you're not bothered by this because you know that there is pretty strong evidence as to the benefit of vaccines. We don't have smallpox anymore, which was an absolutely horrendous disease. Some people may say the numbers were dropping beforehand and so on. But yes, let's look at the science. Let's look at the true evidence. Let's make sure that there's nothing we're missing. And then from that point, you're in a strong position to educate people again about the strengths and the weaknesses. And that's the other point. Never go into this protecting and pretending that your interventions can't cause problems. You must acknowledge adverse events, you must acknowledge risks. And therefore, in that way, that's the best way that we can protect the future for health across the globe. So, some work to be done. And as I said, because I have been relatively critical in this book, it's largely being suppressed. And no, but people are still getting to it. We're still at number one. Please support us this Christmas. We put in your reviews. We've got 3 5-star reviews so far in the past week. And so please join us in looking at the science and ensuring that everyone is well prepared for what is an ongoing viral challenge to the whole population. Have a great evening.